we're going to look back over kind of the themes that we've tracked in 2024, and then try to project where things will go in the future. And I guess with that, we will talk Wes Huff and Joe Rogan, because again, I think that Joe Rogan's podcast is a barometer for culture at large. I think that any podcast that gets as big or approaches the size of like JRE or some of these other podcasts is clearly helping us diagnose the soul of the city, the soul of humanity, borrowing from Socrates there. If you want to diagnose the soul of what's going on in the individual, but at a bigger scale, you have to look at what happens at the city level. And nowadays, we don't just look at what's happening at the city level, but we do look more globally, and podcasts are one of the ways that we do that. And so, clearly Joe has been curious about Christianity. Sort of famously, one of the things that one of our themes at least, has been sort of looking at the spiritual formation of someone like Joe Rogan, and letting his curiosity sort of lead us in a way that hopefully isn't voyeuristic and weird, but yeah, seeing that development has been really, really interesting to me as a Christian person, as a person who cares deeply about faith, and as a person who actually really appreciates the skepticism of Joe Rogan, because one of the things that this podcast helps me do is sort of break out of my own echo chamber, if that makes sense. Joe's skepticism allows me to kind of think through, okay, another person's voice, another person looking at Christianity from a different perspective, asking good questions. And it's always been a bit of a frustration for me as a Christian to listen to Joe and his guests talk about Christianity with very little expertise in the matter. I've always thought that Michael Heiser, if he was still alive, would just be the perfect Joe Rogan podcast guest. And since Michael Heiser has passed away, I do my best to try to find Heiser clips that fit with Joe Rogan's questions, and we sort of mash up Heiser and Rogan often. And so that frustration as a Christian of listening to Joe talk about the Bible, talk about ancient history, talk about these things with like Graham Hancock, for example. Those are great conversations, but it's always frustrating to be like, oh man, if only someone else was there to kind of give the Christian perspective, that would be great. And yet Joe seemed, at least historically, has seemed hesitant to have kind of just a normie Christian evangelical apologist on his podcast. But of course, he had Stephen C. Meyer. We can go all the way back in our podcast and find that Stephen C. Meyer one. Let's see where it was awesome to see Joe bring Stephen Meyer on. And the clue there was Joe told Stephen that Joe had been watching Stephen's clips, right? I do think Joe consumes, I would be really interested to see his YouTube algorithm. What kind of YouTube videos is Joe Rogan consuming? But clearly he had been asking questions of the algorithm or something like that, and a Stephen Meyer video showed up. He watched enough Stephen Meyer and then invited him on the podcast. The thing that I felt, and I pointed this out in the podcast, I guess I can leave a link to this one, Joe was asking Stephen Meyer just very personal questions, like, what do you think? What do you think about this? And Meyer, to his credit, I thought it was a great interview, and I thought Stephen Meyer did a great job. But there are moments where I really felt like Stephen could just open up and just be real honest. Just be real honest about doubts, about whatever. But he didn't feel, I got the sense that Stephen Meyer didn't feel like he could do that because, of course, he represents an apologetics organization. He works for an organization. He represents a church. He represents a community of believers. And he doesn't want to sort of misrepresent them, and maybe doesn't feel like he has permission. And that's one thing that I think we need to do better as a church, to just give people permission to kind of like drift off into heresy for a second, knowing full well that we can trust in the community of believers that we call the church to say, he's okay. Stephen Meyer's okay. It's okay that he doubts something. Will he sell fewer books? Yeah, maybe. Maybe he'll sell fewer books, but it's okay to doubt. It's okay to doubt. And so that was my one piece of sort of criticism about Stephen Meyer. I thought it was a great interview, it showed us a year ago, it showed us that Joe is very curious to find these answers, that he's going to have Stephen Meyer on, just sort of like a normie evangelical on, the Joe Rogan podcast where he's, normally talking about alien abductions and DMT and, whatever. Now, this video actually leads to another video from 2024. Part of Christianity is that you declare the gospel, but the other part of Christianity is that you demonstrate the gospel with your life. And podcasting is going to be a very interesting future for the church, for Christian people, because I do think people are craving honest conversation. And one of the struggles that the church has had in modernity, let's say, is that it seems like people have to put on a face to come to church. And bringing us back to Joe Rogan, I never thought that a William Lane Craig interview would do well. I know there's like a petition to get William Lane Craig on JRE. I just don't. That's not what podcasting is for. That's not what JRE is for. That's not what the Joe Rogan Experience is for. It's a conversation. He's trying to have a conversation, and he was trying to have a conversation with Stephen C. Meyer. Now, I know I said that we were going to talk about Wes Huff, and I didn't. Now you have someone like Wes Huff. Now, I don't know when this maybe comes out tomorrow. So this is as of 3 hours ago. Wes says something really incredible happened today, pictured with Joe Rogan. There you go. And if you have biceps like Wes Huff, then you get invited on Joe Rogan. That's why I'll never get invited on Joe Rogan. I just don't have the biceps. I just don't have it. Let alone the fact, the scholarship and all the work, the research that Wes has done. But yeah, good for Joe Rogan. After having Billy Carson on, he literally couldn't avoid not having Wes Huff on, and I think for good reason. We've pointed this out before, but Joe Rogan does opponent processing. He has somebody on like Stephen C. Meyer or somebody like Billy Carson. So I think maybe I even said plagiarizing on there from other people, and sort of just counting on the overall ignorance of his audience to not really check his claims. But when he went on with Wes Huff, Wes has the scholarship. He's a Bible historian. He knows the languages. He is not as interested in aliens, as far as I understand, as a Michael Heiser would have been. But he does seem like he has the same kind of background as Heiser as far as in the languages. He understands Old and New Testament. He looks at the documents. And that is something that Joe has always been curious about. You can go back to the Diana Walsh Pasulka episode. That's where things really started to move in an interesting direction. So Joe is always asking these questions about the Bible, about how they've translated the Bible, how they've copied the Bible over time. But he's always up until this point, has been asking those questions to people that don't have the answers. He's not asking them to Bible scholars. He's just asking them to his friends like Duncan Trussell and all these other people. Like, he's just going, hey, yeah, I wonder how we got the Bible. And it's like, could you maybe have a Bible scholar on? This is the same problem is happening with Jordan Peterson, isn't it? I mean, he's going through the Gospels. Does he have a New Testament scholar on the panel? I don't even know. I don't think so. But yeah, so now you throw someone like Wes Huff in there, and now we get to what I think is maybe an important part of the conversation, which is kind of moving away from where public theology had been taking place, which was in the realm of apologetics, which is fine, and did a lot of work on campuses and things like that. But what we're seeing, and I think this will be a theme for 2024, is just the fact that we do not have a public theologian. We don't have, like, those days are gone, where we went to some, Spurgeon or whoever, even like someone like J.I. Packer maybe more recently, or a Tim Keller, like someone who existed in the public sphere as, we can ask questions like this to that person or this group of people. Just we're suffering under the lack of of a good public theological discourse, or we're suffering under the absence of a good public theologian. And maybe again, to Heiser's point, to bring up Heiser again, he would have been somebody because he just didn't talk like a church guy. He didn't talk like a church Christian. He went to UFO conventions, like he was conversant with like Zachariah Sitchins and some of these like strange out there guys. Probably would have been very conversant with someone like Billy Carson making claims about the Emerald Tablets of Thoth and stuff like that. So Heiser is a great person because he just doesn't, I don't know. And I think that people they can anticipate the normal sort of church Christian answer. Does that but someone like Heiser, and I don't know Wes Huff well enough. I don't know a lot of his stuff. In this interview, Wes opens up in a way that I had hoped Stephen Meyer would have done when he went on JRE. Because Wes talks about an illness that he had where he was paralyzed and he couldn't walk for a period of time and then was like miraculously healed. And I think if you can open up about stuff like that on a podcast like this one, I don't know what this Julian Dory, I don't know his podcast, but something like that. That's what Rogan was trying to get Stephen Meyer to open up about. Where does this really hit you? I get you have the answers here. You have the philosophical and the scholarly sort of answers, but is there a connection between what you're declaring and how you live your life? Demonstrate for me where these ideas about God really hit home. And I think, and I don't know where, obviously the episode hasn't released yet, but something like that would be really impactful on a Joe Rogan podcast. A public theologian who feels confident enough, set apart Christ as Lord in your heart, who feels confident enough to just say, yeah, I went through this period of doubt. I went through a dark night of the soul. I suffered through illness. I don't have an explanation. I don't have a full explanation for it, but I just know who has the words of life. Who else has the words of life? That's what it comes down to, I think, for me. The point about Wes Huff is, yes, he's a Bible scholar. He's going to be able to answer the nuanced questions that Joe's going to have. I think Wes is going to do a great job. I think he's going to give Joe satisfactory answers. Just what little I've heard from Wes, he has a great way of explaining things where he doesn't appear to be super defensive, like he has an ideology that he can't let go of. He's very interested in finding the truth. He happens to have found the truth in the person of Christ and the Word of God, and he is open and willing to talk about some of the textual issues, translation issues, and things like that. He just doesn't sound as ideologically committed as maybe someone who would go on Joe Rogan, like maybe William Lane Craig, who I think would also do a great job, but would approach it with kind of like, I need to defend my tribe. I need to defend Christianity. I don't want to get this wrong. I want to have the, great philosophical answers and yet overlook the fact that the gospel that I preach has to be consistent with the life that I live. Going back to Steve Lawson, Alan Graham. One of the themes that I have been following from the beginning of this podcast is something that Adam Curry said on one of the first videos. If you go way back, I think it's like the third video on this channel. Adam Curry said it was the people in his life that started pointing him to Jesus. It was the Christians around him who were like, you know what? You're not that bad. You're not. I always thought Christians were so uptight and judgmental, but you guys are great. And then once that started to develop, he started to ask good questions about the Bible and how do you know Jesus rose from the dead? And then he reads Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and there you go. The message that he heard was consistent with the people that he had come into contact with. Joe Rogan sat down with Alan, who's not a theologian, who's not, a scholar, not a Bible scholar. He's just a guy who loves Jesus and wants to live like Jesus. And it was impactful for Joe. And that, I think, is the key. You have somebody, you come into contact with people like Alan Graham, and they show you Jesus as much as they tell you about Jesus. And that is powerful. Can we do that with podcasts? Can we do that online? Can we show people Jesus if we're trying to interact through an online medium? I don't know. I don't know. But I believe so. Because I believe that the Spirit of God is active in the church, I don't know what we will see, but I think people will start to pick up on the fact that there's something different about these. There's something different about Paul Vanderklay and the crew at TLC. There's something different about the way that group of people use the internet and have conversation with one another.